I'm pleased to be speaking before the 4th International Conference of Freedom of the Press. Jerusalem is one of my favorite cities, and it's unfortunate we have to meet virtually. I hope to attend a future conference in person when things get back to normal. For the past decade, I've been in charge of the fact-checker column at the Washington Post. It originally had been launched during the 2008 campaign as a temporary feature started by a former colleague of mine, Michael Dobbs. Now, before doing the fact-checker, Dobbs had been a distinguished diplomatic correspondent. And when the editors of the Washington Post approached me and asked me to revive the fact-checker as a permanent feature, I had been the chief diplomatic correspondent of the Post for 9 years. So you might wonder, what does writing about diplomacy and foreign affairs have to do with political fact-checking? The answer is that diplomatic reporting requires close scrutiny of words and phrases in order to determine their deeper meaning. Diplomatic statements often obscure the reality of the situation. You have to learn how to crack the code. For an instance, a diplomat might emerge from a meeting and say the two countries had a frank exchange of views. That really means they were screaming at each other. When I was covering the State Department, one of my editors said to me, "Kessler, I just realized you write about fog. Sometimes it's light fog, sometimes it's dark fog, but it's still fog." So since diplomats are trying to obscure differences and smooth over trouble spots, a good diplomatic reporter has to be attuned to even the slightest changes of wording. One of my biggest scoops was when in 2009, I reported that the Obama administration was prepared to let US officials meet one-on-one with Iranian diplomats to discuss the nuclear issue. Under the Bush administration, such contacts were forbidden. The story appeared on the Post website, and I immediately got an anxious call from the White House. The official asked me, how did I know this? The answer is I'd been posing the same question for weeks to a senior American diplomat. Will the Americans talk to the Iranians? The answer was always, no, we're not going to do that. Then at a news conference, I asked again, and his answer was subtly different. To the untrained ear, it still sounded like no, but I knew he was sending me a signal that the administration's position had changed. So with confidence, I was able to write an authoritative article. Fact-checking the statements of politicians also involves decoding messages. Politicians and interest groups use facts and figures that buttress the arguments of whatever policy they're advocating. Essentially, you have to look at politicians as salesmen. And just like you would not buy a used car without checking under the hood, neither should you accept what a politician says to advance his or her policy preferences without checking out the facts. In politics, you only succeed if you win. And after nearly 40 years of covering government, politics, and diplomacy, I have found there's little difference between political parties on one key issue. They will always stretch the truth if they believe it will give them a political advantage. That is the rationale behind the fact-checker, which I write with 2 colleagues. At least 5 days a week, we take a detailed look at a politician's statement and examine the facts behind that claim. And then we make a ruling, ranging from 1 to 4 Pinocchios on how truthful that statement is. It's kind of like a reverse restaurant review. 1 Pinocchio is a selective telling of the truth. Some omissions and exaggerations, but no outright falsehoods. 2 Pinocchios is basically half true, often a claim lacking context. 3 Pinocchios is seriously misleading. 4 Pinocchios is for whoppers. Now, I've learned over the years that no politician likes to get Pinocchios, and some people get pretty mad at times. The Israeli embassy in Washington even complained officially when I gave 2 Pinocchios to Bibi Netanyahu. Now, just about every American politician earns a 4 Pinocchio ruling at some point, but it's maybe 1 or 2 times out of every 10 rulings. Barack Obama, for instance, earned 4 Pinocchios about 15% of the time, as did Joe Biden. The same held true for Mitt Romney, Jeb Bush, and many other Republicans. Then came Donald Trump. I have never encountered a politician so cavalier about the facts than Donald Trump. He earned 4 Pinocchio ratings 65% of the time during his first presidential campaign. It got even worse during his presidency. He falsely said that millions of undocumented immigrants voted in the 2016 election, just enough to give him the edge in the popular vote, but there was no evidence to back up that claim. Then he fabricated an election fraud that supposedly cost him the 2020 election. He accused Obama of wiretapping him, again with no evidence. He reinforced his lies with constant repetition. Nearly 300 times, he claimed he passed the biggest tax cut in US history, when in fact, I checked, it only ranks in 8th place. Nearly 500 times, he said he created the greatest economy in the history of the world. In fact, he once even extended that boast to the greatest economy in the history of the universe. Most politicians will quietly drop a false talking point. Biden has already shown he will do that after being fact-checked, but not Trump. At the Washington Post, we keep careful track of Trump's statements. By the end of his presidency, we counted 30,573 false or misleading claims. That's an average of 21 erroneous claims a day. What's especially striking is how the tsunami of untruths kept rising the longer Trump served as president and became increasingly unmoored from the truth. Trump averaged about 6 claims a day in his first year as president, 16 claims a day in his second year, 22 claims a day in his third year, and 39 claims a day in his final year. Put another way, it took him 27 months to reach 10,000 claims and an additional 14 months to reach 20,000. He then exceeded the 30,000 mark less than 5 months later. Oddly, though our fact checks seem to have little impact on Trump's behavior, he seemed obsessed with the Pinocchios. More than 20 times as president, he complained openly about the Pinocchios or insisted that one of his political foes deserved Pinocchios. My favorite of these quotes was this: "I have to tell you, I have to be always very truthful because if I'm a little bit off, they call me a liar. They'll say he gets a Pinocchio in a stupid Washington Post. They're Pinocchio." A key goal of our fact check column is to help consumers of news become better judges of fact-based statements. I want to help readers become more discerning about hearing the weasel words and caveats that politicians routinely insert in their statements in order to present a more rosy or dire picture than the facts suggest. We get many of the ideas for fact checks from queries from readers who are puzzled by something they heard a politician say on the radio or on TV. One of my favorite parts of the job is debunking statistics that somehow become part of the national conversation in the United States. For instance, Democrats often said that 40% of guns in the United States are sold without background checks. That was not true. When I first investigated this number, it turned out it was derived from one telephone survey of 251 people done in the early 1990s. So it was kind of old and it had a huge margin of error. Then, after I obtained the original survey results and drilled down in the data, I discovered that a lot of the guns that did not have background checks were gifts and inheritances. Those transactions already are exempt from background checks and would stay exempt even under proposals to tighten the law. I concluded the number of guns purchased without a background check was about 14%, not 40%. That number was confirmed when researchers at Harvard redid the survey in 2017 in response to my fact check. The number of guns purchased without a background check, 13%. Then there was the claim that human trafficking was a $9.5 billion business in the United States. I have debunked a lot of human trafficking statistics over the year. It's a horrific crime, but there's little data, and advocates who fight trafficking often cite flimsy numbers. I always point out that advocates do more damage to their cause when they use inaccurate statistics. In this case, politicians said that this $9.5 billion estimate was from the FBI. They could point to a State Department report from 2006 that said it was an FBI number. So I checked with the FBI, and they got back to me and said, no, that's not our number. I went to the State Department. They could not tell me where it got that number or why it even attributed to the FBI. I finally figured out that the $9.5 billion figure came from congressional testimony in 2004 by an official at the Immigration Agency. And it was not for profits for human trafficking. It was an estimate of profits for human smuggling around the world, not just in the United States. And smuggling, of course, does not involve the use of force or coercion. Unfortunately, because of the State Department's error, the $9.5 billion figure had been wrongly cited as an official FBI estimate for human trafficking in books, a congressional research report, and other studies. What's the lesson from these examples? If a statistic sounds too fantastic or extreme, there's probably a good reason for that. As the saying goes, everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. With the rise of Trump and the increasing influence of social media, the task of convincing people that there's an agreed set of facts has become even harder, even when the information comes from a nonpartisan news organization like the Washington Post. Social science research shows that people are receptive to information that confirms their preconceived notions, especially when it comes to politics. One study quizzed participants on data that measured the effectiveness of a skin cream product. People with good math skills could interpret the data correctly. But when the same survey participants were shown similar numbers on whether gun control increased or decreased crime, liberals and conservatives who were good at math misinterpret the results to conform to their political leanings. In other words, once politics was introduced, people could not accept a finding that conflicted with their beliefs, even if it meant forgetting how to correctly read data on a chart. On top of that, a 2017 study found that 2/3 of liberals and conservatives surveyed were simply uninterested in hearing the views of the other side on contentious issues such as guns and climate change, even when they were offered extra money in the survey to do so. Another study from 2018 found that people exposed to tweets from political opponents for a month actually made them less tolerant. Liberals became somewhat more liberal, and conservatives became substantially more conservative. I experience this on a daily basis. Swarms of Bernie Sanders fans have attacked me ruthlessly from the left whenever I fact-check the senator from Vermont. Then, if I rate poorly a statement by a Republican, the other side of the Twitterverse will gang up on me. Increasingly, the criticism from both camps has become highly personal, with Twitter trolls digging into my family history in an effort to discredit my findings. Moreover, while facts and figures are a critical part of most politicians' arsenals, whether people actually care if those facts are correct is open to question. Supporting a blue or red candidate has become an important part of Americans' identity. In the age of Trump, there was evidence that Republicans had grown less concerned about presidents being honest than they were a decade earlier. A 2007 poll found that 71% of Republicans said it was extremely important for presidential candidates to be honest, similar to 70% of Democrats and 66% of independents. Fast forward to 2008, when a Washington Post poll asked the same question and found that identical shares of Democrats and independents still prioritized honesty in presidential candidates, but the share of Republicans who said honesty was extremely important had fallen to 49%, 22 points lower than in the poll a decade earlier. That statistically significant shift suggests that many Republicans realized that Trump often lied, but they had decided that truth-telling was less important than the message he sent about the United States and the forces he blamed for his troubles. The Washington Post poll also found that clear majorities across party lines said it was never acceptable for political leaders to make false statements. But there was an important distinction between the two parties. 41% of Republicans said false claims are sometimes acceptable to do what's right for the country, while only 25% of Democrats and 26% of independents agreed. In recent years, interest in political fact-checking has exploded around the globe. In 2011, when I took over the fact checker, there was just a handful of fact-checking organizations in the world, 3 of which were in the United States. Now, there are more than 300 fact-checking organizations in just about every country in Europe and Latin America, and it is spreading rapidly across Africa and Asia as well. The number of fact-checkers has doubled since 2016, according to a count by Duke University, with fact-checking organizations now found in 84 countries, including an excellent fact-checking website called The Whistle here in Israel. It turns out that voters in many countries want to hold politicians accountable for their statements and promises. The internet has empowered non-governmental groups and journalistic organizations to challenge politicians and even bring accountability and journalistic rigor to countries without much of a tradition of press freedom. These groups are able to spread their reports through social media at a fraction of the cost of traditional newsprint-based journalism. I helped craft a set of international principles to guide the movement going forward, which included committing to fact-check all political parties fairly and without favor. Members of the International Fact-Checking Network, which agree to these principles, are assessed every year by outside experts to make sure their fact-checking organization is living up to these principles. And then the board of the IFCN votes on whether to accept that organization as a member for another year. During the coronavirus pandemic, IFCN members joined together to create the Coronavirus Facts Database. There were contributions by more than 90 fact-checkers in 70 countries in 40 different languages. The database contains more than 12,000 fact checks, and it has allowed researchers to trace the spread of major COVID-19 claims across the globe. The stunning growth of fact-checking has not only been personally satisfying to me, but it demonstrates fact-checking is not a phenomenon that is related only to Donald Trump. The fact-checking world may have gotten a bit quieter in the United States this year, but other countries face challenges with leaders who disdain facts as much as Trump. So I am confident that growth in fact-checking will only continue. One of the biggest challenges going forward is manipulated video, which can spread rapidly across social media before it is debunked. At the Washington Post in 2019, we crafted a guide to manipulated video as part of an effort to standardize how fact-checkers label different kinds of video. Those terms have been adopted as part of fact checks that are categorized in Google and other web browsers. In 2020, we faced challenges on many fronts: false claims about the coronavirus, manipulated video, and the US presidential election. Trump was at the center of much of that. He routinely lied about the pandemic, either to damage his perceived foes or to claim the United States was doing better than it was. He frequently touted quick fixes that were scientifically dubious. Meanwhile, his campaign was a master of using manipulated video in order to promote false claims about Biden, either on Biden's policy positions or to suggest Biden was going senile. Now, it's not as if Biden is a paragon of honesty. He routinely stretched the facts, and we occasionally caught his campaign also playing tricks with video. But it felt like a trickle compared to the fire hose produced by Trump. The challenge we faced was not the fact-checking per se, but the volumes of claims we needed to fact-check while also maintaining our database as Trump barnstormed the country, giving as many as 5 speeches a day, with each speech containing 80 to 90 false claims. To provide some context for those numbers, we counted fewer claims than that in all of Biden's first 100 days. Then came the presidential election. We kind of thought we were done. I even wrote an article on November 9 titled "Fact-Checking in the Post-Trump Era." Little did we know that Trump would seek to discredit an election that he decisively lost, whipping his supporters into such a frenzy that a mob attacked the Capitol 2 months later as lawmakers gathered to formally certify the election result. We had to keep up the pace of fact-checking, constantly vetting the accuracy of the claims made by Trump and his surrogates, such as former Mayor Rudolph Giuliani. Luckily, they were so absurd that many were pretty easy to debunk. In fact, it even became too much for the social media companies like Twitter and Facebook, which had done so much to help expand the reach of Trump's falsehoods. Banning Trump from Twitter and Facebook certainly made my life easier. One question I frequently get from non-journalists is, how do I prevent my personal political beliefs from swaying the rulings I make on statements by politicians? I think it's a funny question because as a journalist, I am trained to let the facts lead the way rather than any personal beliefs I might have. But I understand how in this highly partisan age, people can be surprised that personal beliefs do not play a role in reporting. But that's the way it works in journalism, as many of the journalists watching this know. The facts matter, not the politics. Expanded access to information for both readers and reporters has many advantages, but the technological changes also have come at a cost. Newspapers and evening news shows once provided people with a common point of reference, a basic foundation of fact. Now citizens are increasingly sorted into ideological cul-de-sacs, deciding if they want their news slanted left or right. On top of that, Facebook and Twitter have built algorithms that guide users toward material with ever more extreme perspectives based on what you've already read. The internet, in other words, has helped open a world of information and facts, but that freedom is wasted if people are content to only absorb facts and political analyses that match their left or right political inclinations. We seem to have gotten richer with information, but poorer in knowledge and understanding. I always tell people you have to be willing to look beyond the conventional wisdom. Indeed, one thing everyone should do is diversify their social media feeds. So if you're a liberal, follow some conservatives. If you're conservative, follow some liberals. Read people who will challenge your point of view. Neither side has a monopoly on the truth, and the other side of the debate isn't evil either. If you only read people you agree with, you will become intellectually lazy. I find I often learn more from people I disagree with because it forces me to challenge my own assumptions. You're never too young or too old to learn something new. Now, at this point, I would be saying I look forward to hearing your questions because I love the Q&A part of any speech. Unfortunately, because this is pre-recorded, we're not actually able to do that. So I welcome anyone who has a follow-up question to write to me at the Washington Post, glenn.kessler@washpost.com. Put in the header that this is a follow-up to the conference, and I will try to respond to any questions you might have. And I hope this is a great conference for everyone. Thank you.